the summer of 1947, the United States Army told the world it had recovered a flying disc. That is not a legend, and it is not a leak. On July 8th, the press office at Roswell Army Airfield put it in writing. The wire services carried it, and by the following day, the Army had taken it back and replaced it with a weather balloon. Wikipedia's own account of the incident states it that flatly, debris recovered by Roswell personnel, a flying disc announced, then withdrawn. For 70 years, everyone has argued about the retraction. Almost no one has asked about the announcement. There is a document that asks about the announcement. 91 typed pages, carbon copy, produced on a Remington typewriter in the winter of 1984 by a man named Vernon Lee Aldrich, who spent 1947 as a warrant officer doing counterintelligence work in New Mexico. On page 53 of that statement, there is a sentence he typed and then struck out, hitting the X key over each letter, hard enough that the strike-through went through the carbon. You can still read most of what's underneath. I'm going to show you where that sentence sits and what surrounds it before this episode ends. I want to be straight with you about where I stand, because this channel doesn't work if I'm not. My default setting is doubt. A typed statement from the 1980s, about events from the 1940s, from a man who is now dead, is close to the weakest form of evidence that exists. I know that. I started reading the Aldrich pages, expecting to fold them into the tall stack of Roswell paper that goes nowhere. I read all 91 twice, and I have not been able to put them down since. Not because they claim more than the other accounts, because they claim less, and the less they claim is stranger. Here is Aldrich's argument, compressed to one line, and then I'll spend the rest of this episode taking it apart. He says the famous debris field was not discovered. He says it was installed. And he says he knows because installing it was his job. Start with who he was, as far as the record allows. Vernon Lee Aldrich, born 1919, Western Kansas, Army from 1941. By his own account, he moved into counterintelligence work during the war years. The Army has maintained a dedicated intelligence branch for over a century. That much is simply organizational fact. And by 1947, he was a warrant officer working out of New Mexico, the kind of man whose job was not secrets themselves, but the handling of the people near secrets. He describes the work without romance. Interviews, file checks, sitting in cars. He calls himself, on page 4, a janitor for attention. Where attention spilled, he cleaned it up. The mundane version of his July 1947 is the version we all know. A rancher finds scattered wreckage northwest of Roswell. The base sends men. The disc release goes out on the 8th, the balloon correction follows, and decades later the Air Force ties the whole thing to Project Mogul, a classified balloon program. Wikipedia's page on Mogul says plainly that the program's chief legacy is Roswell, a crashed Mogul array mistaken for something from somewhere else. That is the official arc. Bait, blunder, balloon. Aldrich's version keeps every one of those events and reverses the current running through them. On page 19, he writes, and I'm quoting the carbon exactly, "The mistake people make is thinking the press release was the accident. The press release was the product. Everything before it was manufacturing." He lays out a principle first, the way a man explains his trade to a nephew. "You cannot make a witness unsee something," he writes. "There is no procedure for that. What you can do is give the witness, and everyone the witness will ever talk to, a better thing to look at. Not a smaller story, a bigger one aimed 2 degrees off true." He says the men he worked under called this feeding the dog from the wrong hand. You do not starve curiosity. You feed it until it follows you. And then he makes the claim that separates his account from every other Roswell account I have read. He says that on the morning of July 7th, 1947, he was one of 5 men on a ranch pasture northwest of Roswell, and that they were not gathering debris. They were distributing it. Foil, struts, neoprene, the kind of material that would photograph strangely and handle strangely and mean nothing. He says it came out of a base warehouse. He says the pasture was chosen because it had already had traffic across it, so tire marks proved nothing. He says the scatter pattern was walked out deliberately loose because, page 22, a tidy field looks placed. A messy field looks fallen. Sit with what that means, if it's true. and I am a long way from telling you it's true. It means the debris that families have argued about at kitchen tables for 3 generations. The material Jesse Marcel handled, the material his son described being shown on the kitchen floor, was real, physical, and utterly beside the point. It means every later analysis that found the wreckage mundane found exactly what it was supposed to find. The misdirection would not merely have survived scrutiny. It would have been powered by scrutiny. Every skeptic who proved the debris was balloon wreckage was doing the operation's maintenance work for free, decades after everyone who built it was gone, which raises the only question that matters. Misdirection is a pointer, and a pointer aims away from something. Away from what? Aldrich answers that in 11 pages near the middle of the statement, and they are the 11 pages that changed how I read the other 80. He calls it the North Job. Night of July 5th. 2 days before the pasture work, 3 days before the press release. He is handed sealed orders and a driver and sent roughly 40 miles northwest of the town. He never gives coordinates, and he says the omission is deliberate even in 1984, which is either discipline or theater, and I genuinely cannot tell you which. He arrives a little after 1 in the morning at a stretch of scrubland with portable lights already up and a flatbed truck already loaded. His entire assignment is to hand an envelope to a lieutenant colonel whose name he never learned and drive back. He is on the ground, by his own estimate, under 4 minutes. In those 4 minutes, the wind lifts the corner of a tarp on the flatbed. What follows is the part of the statement I keep returning to because of what it does not do. It does not gasp. There are no adjectives of horror in it, none of the pulp vocabulary a fabricator reaches for. It reads like an inventory taken by a tired man. On the flatbed, among crates, a stretcher. On the stretcher, a figure, and he gives it maybe 140 words. Slight. He guesses under 5 feet, and he notes that he is guessing because it was lying down. The head large in proportion, the way a child's is. No ears that he could see, only a slight ridging where ears would be. The nose 2 openings, no bridge to speak of. A mouth he describes as a line that had never been used. 4 fingers on the one hand visible, longer than a man's, tapered, without nails that he could make out in that light. And the skin. He circles this, types it, qualifies it. Gray, but not a paint gray, not a metal gray. He settles on the gray of newspaper left out in the rain, and then adds, "It looked wrong to leave it in the wind." Not a monster. Not a marvel. A body on a stretcher that a Kansas farm kid thought should be covered up. That sentence has the wrong temperature for a hoax, and I'll come back to why the wrong temperature matters. Then page 53. He writes that as he stood by the flatbed, before the tarp was pulled back down, something happened that he spent 37 years declining to write. He says it was not a sound. He is emphatic, almost irritated with himself, that it was not a sound, not words, not a voice in the way a voice is a thing in the air. He describes a pressure arriving behind his eyes, carrying what he can only call a weight of meaning with no language wrapped around it, the way you can wake from a dream certain of something and unable to say what. And then he types a sentence, and then he X's it out, hard, and the next line reads, "That is as far as I am able to go and be accurate." Under the strike-through, most of the letters survive. The sentence appears to begin, "It knew my." The 4th word is destroyed. It is the only overstrike in 91 pages. The rest of the statement is clean typing, and this one sentence he killed and then left the corpse of it on the page, in a document he intended someone to eventually read. I have turned that over more times than I can count. A man inventing a story writes the sentence or doesn't. He does not write it, unwrite it, and preserve the unwriting. That is what a struggle looks like on paper. Now, here is where the doubter in me stands up and starts pacing, and I want you to pace with me, because everything I've just read you hangs on a stack of paper with a dead man behind it, and paper has burned this field before. Problem 1 is the calendar. Aldrich typed this in the winter of 1984. Roswell had already come back from the dead by then. Wikipedia's page on U/F. Conspiracy Theories notes that the incident resurfaced in 1978 when the researcher Stanton Friedman interviewed Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer who'd handled the original debris. 2 years after that came the 1980 book, The Roswell Incident, which put the whole story back on shelves. So by the time Aldrich rolled that first page into the Remington, the template existed in public. He could have read all of it. Any honest telling of this story has to hand you that fact, so I'm handing it to you. Problem 2 is the era of the document itself. The 1980s were the golden age of Roswell paper fraud. The majestic 12 documents, supposedly briefing papers for a secret crash retrieval committee, circulated in exactly this period, and Wikipedia describes them today without hedging. Fake documents, first put into circulation by ufologists themselves. That is the environment this carbon copy comes from. A decade in which people manufactured official-looking Roswell paper, sometimes for money, sometimes, apparently, for the pleasure of watching it spread. Problem 3 is the machinery inside every human skull, including yours and mine. 37 years passed between the flatbed and the typewriter. Research published in the Journal of Applied Research in Memory and Cognition in 2022 found that long retention intervals corrode the relationship between a witness's confidence and a witness's accuracy, meaning that after enough years, how sure someone sounds tells you almost nothing about how right they are. Aldrich sounds very sure. That is worth exactly what the science says it's worth. And this specific territory has its own specific hazard. The psychologist Nicholas Spanos argued that U.F. abduction accounts can be understood as complex false memories, assembled socially, sincerely believed by the people carrying them. Sincerity is not evidence. Though I'll note, because fairness cuts both ways, that a 1996 paper in Psychological Inquiry by Leonard, Newman, and Roy Baumeister pushed back on the tidy version of that story, arguing the phenomenon doesn't collapse neatly into just another false memory. The honest summary of the memory science is that it dissolves certainty in both directions. It will not let me believe Aldrich, and it will not let me wave him away on the grounds that people don't sincerely report impossible things. They do. Constantly. In both directions. NN, so why am I still holding these pages? NN because of what a fabrication built in 1984 would look like, and what this isn't. A man riding the wave that Friedman in the book created would ride it. He would confirm the famous debris, embroider it, put himself closer to the center of the story everyone already wanted. Aldrich does the opposite. He takes the single most beloved artifact of the entire mythology, the wreckage itself, and calls it a stage prop from a warehouse. He demotes the thing the audience came for. He gives himself 4 minutes at the real site, no heroics, no souvenir, one glimpse under a tarp corner, and a sentence he refuses to finish. Invented stories are generous to their inventors. This one is stingy. Invented stories are complete. This one has holes the author points at. Real recollection has the wrong details in it. The note about the wind, the guess he flags as a guess, the strike-through he preserves. Fabrication almost never thinks to install its own damage. NN that is an argument about texture, not proof, and I know the difference. Hold it loosely. Now follow the paper, because the pages themselves have a biography, and it is the part of this story I can actually trace. And it ends the way these stories keep ending. N. Aldrich typed an original and 1 carbon. In 1986, he mailed the carbon to his nephew, Dale Petrie, in Amarillo, inside a folded note that said, according to the family, "Not until I'm gone." Vernon Aldrich died in March of 1989 in Tucumcari, New Mexico, aged 69. The original, his top copy, has never surfaced. Petrie told his wife he'd read the carbon once and put it away. He kept it in a green footlocker for 17 years and died in 2003. The footlocker went into a storage unit with the rest of his effects. The unit lapsed, and in February of 2004, its contents were auctioned. A retired schoolteacher named Carl Wessels bought the footlocker, sight mostly unseen, for $42. NN $42. That is what the only known copy of this statement changed hands for. underneath a tarp of old shirts and a broken radio. Wessels didn't read it for close to 5 years. When he did, in 2009, he did something quietly brilliant. He photographed every page, both memory cards, before telling a single person. Then he showed the carbon to a volunteer at a local historical society, asking, essentially, is this anything? Word travels in small towns the way water travels downhill. In the spring of 2011, 2 men visited Carl Wessels at his home. His daughter, who has spoken about this since, says they were polite, that they carried retired government credentials of some kind she couldn't later name, and that they offered to take the carbon for authentication. They gave him a typed receipt with a phone number. He let them take it. The number was never in service, not disconnected, never assigned. The carbon has not been seen since NN Carl Wessels died of a heart attack in 2016 at 68. And here is the roll call, because this channel always calls the roll. Vernon Aldrich, dead. Dale Petrie, dead. Carl Wessels, dead. Every person who ever held an original page of this statement is gone, and both physical copies are gone with them. What survives is light. The photographs on 2 memory cards passed to Wessels' daughter, scanned and shared with a researcher in 2019. That is what I have been reading. Not paper. The shadow of paper. I tried to walk back up the trail toward Aldrich himself, and this is where the record develops the kind of hole that this channel has learned to treat as a finding in its own right. Carefully, because holes have boring explanations too. A request for Aldrich's Army personnel file comes back empty. Now, I will give you the boring explanation with my own mouth. The 1973 fire at the Records Center in St. Louis destroyed millions of Army personnel files from exactly his era, and his could simply be ash like the rest. It probably is. But a researcher working the alternate record systems, the payroll and voucher indexes that survived because they were stored elsewhere, turned up what appears to be Aldrich's name across 1946 and 1947 with duty entries in every month except one. July of 1947 is blank. June has an entry. August has an entry. July is a white space on the ledger. I have seen a scan of that index page, not the page itself, so grade it accordingly. But I keep looking at that one clean rectangle where a duty station should be in the 1 month of the 1 year that matters. And I'll be honest with you, an absence in exactly the right shape stops feeling like an absence after a while. It starts feeling like an outline. There is one more thread, and then I'll stop pulling, because past this point the rope frays into pure rumor. Aldrich's statement ends not with the being and not with the pasture, but with a manifest. He says his final task connected to the North job was typing a freight document. He was chosen, he believed, precisely because he already knew and could be kept inside the circle. 7 crates, moved by rail. Destination written as a routing code he didn't recognize, direction east. 6 crates listed by weight only. The 7th carried a handling instruction. Ice, re-ice at every stop. He types that he never learned what was in any of them, and then, in the last paragraph of the last page, he stops pretending not to wonder. He writes, I have spent 37 years telling myself the ice was for film stock. Film was shipped on ice in those days. That is true, and I have never once believed it. I don't know what was in the 7th crate. I don't know where East ends. I don't know whether Vernon Aldrich was a counterintelligence man confessing, an old man whose memory had spent 4 decades quietly rebuilding itself around a book he might have read, or something in between those two, which is where most human testimony actually lives. But I know that the most famous crash site in the world has been searched, sampled, argued over, and defended for 3/4 of a century, and if these 91 pages are what they claim to be, all of that devotion was aimed at a decoy. And it worked on the believers and the debunkers alike, feeding both, satisfying neither, forever. That would make Roswell not a secret that leaked. It would make Roswell a lock that was built to be picked, so that no one would ever check the other door. So the questions I'm left with are not the ones I started with. Who chose that pasture, and who signed for the warehouse material that dressed it? Where did a flatbed truck stand under portable lights on the night of July 5th, 1947, 40-some miles northwest of a town that was about to become the most watched place in America? What did a 28-year-old warrant officer receive, behind his eyes, in under 4 minutes, that he could carry for 37 years but could not survive typing? What was the fourth word of that sentence? Who dialed a phone number that never existed? And what shelf is a carbon copy sitting on tonight? And the crate, the one that had to be kept cold, re-iced at every stop, moving east through the dark of July 1947 while the whole world argued about foil in a pasture.